She showed up with 4 kids, no money, and no husband, and said it out loud before he could ask. "I have 4 mouths to feed and no man to help me do it," Evelyn Harper told him, standing in the dirt outside Blackridge Ranch with her chin up and her hands shaking. She'd learned to lead with the number. Get it over with. Watch the man's face change. Watch him find a reason to look away. Gideon Hale didn't look away. He looked at her 4 children, really looked at them, then back at her and said, calm as a man counting fence posts, "You counted wrong. That's 5 chairs, not 4. I've been waiting on the 5th one for a while now." Evelyn thought he was mocking her. He wasn't. And what happened next on that cold October morning at Blackridge Ranch would undo every wall she'd built around her broken heart, and nearly cost her the son she loved most. If this story touches something in you, the kind of quiet longing most people never say out loud, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. Every story we tell here is for the ones who've been counted wrong by people who should have known better. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The morning Evelyn Harper drove her rusted station wagon through the front gate of Blackridge Ranch, she had $31 in her purse, 4 children across the back seat, and a classified ad folded so many times the crease lines had turned white. Ranch hand needed, room and board included. Honest work for honest pay. Inquire at the gate. She had read it so many times she could recite it in the dark. She'd done exactly that, lying awake in the parking lot of a truck stop outside Millhaven 2 nights before, listening to her youngest, Clara, breathe in that shallow way she did when the air was too cold. The station wagon had no working heat. Evelyn had covered the children with every coat she owned, including her own, and she'd stared at that folded paper in the dark and thought, this is the last thing I've got. She didn't think it would work. She never thought anything would work anymore. But you try anyway. That's the thing nobody tells you about desperation. It doesn't make you feel brave. It just makes you move. The gate was iron and old, the kind that had been opened and closed so many times the hinges had worn a groove into the dirt. Beyond it, she could see a long unpaved road cutting across flat land, a barn in the middle distance, and farther back, a 2-story house with a wide porch and dark windows. Quiet. Everything was so quiet. "Mama." That was Lucas, her oldest, 12 years old, and already sounding like he was 40. He was sitting in the front passenger seat because she needed someone to read road signs when her eyes got too tired. He'd been doing that since he was 9. "This the place?" "This is the place." He looked at the house for a long moment. His jaw did that thing, tightened almost imperceptibly, the way it had started doing about 6 months after his father died, like he was bracing, always bracing. "Looks empty," he said. The ad said, "Inquire at the gate." Evelyn put the car in park and got out. The cold hit her immediately, the kind of October cold that meant November was coming fast and wasn't going to be gentle about it. She pulled her cardigan tighter and walked to the gate. There was a small intercom box mounted on a wooden post, the kind someone had installed years ago and never upgraded. She pressed the button. It crackled. Silence. She pressed it again. More silence. She was about to turn back to the car, already composing in her head the next step, the next place, the next folded piece of paper, when she heard boots on gravel. Not from the intercom, from behind her, along the side of the fence, where a man was walking up from the direction of the barn. He was tall, not imposing tall, just tall, wide through the shoulders, wearing a canvas work coat that had seen too many winters. His face was weathered in the way that outdoor work weathers a person, not harshly, but honestly. He looked like a man who spent his days solving problems that couldn't be solved with words. Early to mid-30s, maybe. Dark hair gone slightly gray at the temples. He stopped about 10 feet from her and he waited. Not rudely. He just waited to hear what she had to say. Evelyn had prepared a speech. She'd practiced it in the car mirror. "I am a capable worker. I learn fast. I can cook and clean and manage livestock. I'm not afraid of hard hours." All true. All the right things to lead with. What came out instead was this. "I have 4 children. They're in the car. I have no husband and no money, and I need the job in your ad. I know that's a lot to hear first thing in the morning. I'm telling you now so you don't waste your time or mine." She watched his face. That was the moment she always watched for. The slight shift, the jaw or the eyes, or sometimes just a tiny backward lean. Some part of the body registering the math and finding it unfavorable. 4 children. No husband. No. Thank you for coming. The position has been filled. Gideon Hale's face did nothing. He looked past her toward the station wagon. Through the windshield, she knew he could see Lucas in the front seat and probably the tops of the younger ones' heads in the back. He looked for a long moment, not staring, just taking stock, the way you look at something you're trying to understand rather than judge. Then he looked back at her. "What's your name?" "Evelyn Harper." "How old are your kids?" She kept her voice level. 12, 8, 6, and 4. He nodded slowly. 4 mouths, he said, almost to himself. And she would think about this moment for the rest of her life. The corner of his mouth shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was more like the expression of a man who has just realized something he'd been waiting a long time to realize. "You miscounted," he said. "That's 5 chairs, not 4. She stared at him. "I beg your pardon?" "I've had 5 chairs around my kitchen table for years," he said. "Only ever used one." He unlatched the gate and held it open. "Come on in, Mrs. Harper. I'll put coffee on. Chat." She didn't trust it. That was the truth she carried with her as she pulled the station wagon through the gate and parked it beside the barn. She didn't trust a man who heard 4 children, no husband, and opened a gate. Experience had taught her that kindness, which arrives too easily, usually has a price attached. You just don't find out what the price is until later. But she was down to $31 and a cardigan, and the choice wasn't really a choice at all. The children tumbled out of the car in layers. First Lucas, who got out on his own and stood with his arms crossed, looking at the property with the assessment of someone deciding whether to trust a bridge before crossing it. Then Nora, 8, who grabbed her little sister's hand out of habit before Clara was even fully upright. Clara, 4, who immediately wanted to know if there were horses. And Danny, 6, who said nothing because Danny almost never said anything, but who pressed close to Evelyn's side and held the back of her cardigan in his fist. "There's horses," Gideon said from somewhere behind them. He was latching the gate. He'd heard Clara without appearing to listen. 3 of them. You can meet them after coffee if your mama says it's all right." Clara turned around and looked at him with the absolute unfiltered assessment only a 4-year-old can deliver. "What are their names?" "Buck, Molly, and Henry. I like Molly. Molly's partial to visitors," he said. "She'll like you." Clara seemed to decide right then and there that this was acceptable. Evelyn watched it happen, that instantaneous 4-year-old calculation, and felt something cold move through her. Not because Clara's joy was wrong, because it was so easy. Because her daughter had no defenses left to lose, and Evelyn was the only one standing between all 4 of her children and the next disappointment. She had to make this work. That meant she could not afford to let them get attached. She already knew she was going to lose that battle with Clara. She could only hope to win it with the others. The kitchen was bigger than she expected, clean but not sparse. There were dishes on the drying rack, a cast iron pan hanging on a hook, a stack of seed catalogs on one end of the table. The kind of room that had been used and tended and never quite finished being made comfortable. The table was round and solid, dark wood, and around it sat 5 chairs of slightly different heights and styles, like they'd been collected one at a time over years. She counted them before she could stop herself. 5. He put the coffee on without asking how she took it, then turned and leaned against the counter with his arms crossed. Not defensively, just like a man who didn't know what to do with his hands when he wasn't working. "Tell me about the work you've done," he said. "Not your situation. Your work." That surprised her. Most people led with the situation. "I grew up on a small farm in Callaway County," she said. "My father raised cattle and a little corn. I know fence work, feeding schedules, basic veterinary first aid, and I've midwifed more calves than I can count. After I married, my husband and I ran a small operation in Hartfield. Chickens, a kitchen garden, 2 pigs. Before that fell apart." She paused. "I cook well. I keep a house. I don't sleep in past 5. Gideon was quiet for a moment. What happened in Hartfield? My husband died 3 years ago. I'm sorry. Thank you. She'd learned how to say thank you for condolences without letting them land on her. You absorbed too many of them. You started drowning. What happened after? We lost the property. I moved in with my mother-in-law. That arrangement lasted 8 months. She folded her hands on the table. I've been looking for stable work for about 6 months. With children, there aren't many people who... She stopped, chose different words. The situation complicates most employment options. Gideon nodded once, slow. I have 40 acres, 40 head of cattle, give or take, plus the horses. There's a chicken operation I've been meaning to expand that I haven't had the time or hands for. The house gets away from me when work is heavy. He paused. I'm not looking for just a ranch hand, Mrs. Harper. I need someone who can do several things at once. Sounds like you can. I can? The pay is modest. I'm going to be straight with you. This isn't a wealthy operation, but there's a room for you and a room the children can share, and meals are included, and the work is honest. Lucas had come inside without her noticing. He was standing in the doorway to the kitchen, not saying anything, watching Gideon with an expression Evelyn recognized. Carefully neutral on the surface, war underneath. Gideon noticed him. He didn't make a production of it. He just looked at Lucas the way he'd looked at everything else, straight, without hurry. You're the oldest, he said. Lucas said nothing. What's your name? A beat. Lucas. You ride? Another beat. Lucas hadn't expected that. Some. My dad taught me. I could use a hand with the morning feeding if you want to learn the routine. Up to you. Lucas's jaw did the tightening thing. He looked at his mother, as if trying to figure out whether this was a trap she'd already walked into or one she hadn't seen yet. Evelyn looked back at him steadily. I don't know either, she tried to say with her eyes. We're figuring it out. Lucas looked at Gideon again. Maybe, he said. Gideon accepted that without comment, turned back to the coffee, and poured 2 cups. That first week, she learned the perimeter of what he was and what he wasn't. He was not a talker. He communicated in short, direct sentences, and he didn't fill silence with noise. That should have made her more comfortable. She'd spent years with people who talked too much to cover too little. But instead, it made her more watchful. Silence could hide things as easily as talk could. He was patient with the children in a way that didn't perform itself. He didn't crouch down and speak in a high voice or make a show of being good with kids. He just included them. If he was heading out to check the fence line, he'd mention it in passing, and somehow Danny ended up following along without anyone making it a thing. If Clara asked a question, he answered it at full length, without condescension, as if her question was a reasonable one from a reasonable person. That frightened Evelyn more than cruelty would have. Cruelty she knew how to brace against. She'd been bracing against it for years. Quiet, unhurried patience. That she had no defense for. That was the thing most likely to get her children hurt. She told herself to stay careful. She woke before 5 every morning and had the kitchen started before he came in from the barn. That was her doing. Not because he expected it, but because usefulness was how she justified being there, and she needed to keep on justifying it in case the math changed. On the 4th morning, he came in to find her burning the biscuits. She smelled it half a second too late. She yanked open the oven and pulled out a pan of black-bottom biscuits and stood there holding them, furious at herself. And then she heard a sound from across the kitchen and turned to find him standing in the doorway with his coat still on, looking at the biscuits, and the sound had been a small thing, not quite a laugh, but almost. I'm sorry, she said immediately. I'll make another batch. You burned the bottom, he said. Not the top. Cut the bottom off, they're fine. She looked at the biscuits. He was right. I haven't burned biscuits since I was 15, she said, more to herself than to him. Long morning, he said. Claire had woken up coughing at 2 in the morning. Evelyn hadn't gone back to sleep. I'm fine, she said. He sat down at the table and picked up a biscuit and cut the burnt bottom off and ate the rest of it and didn't say another word about it. She burned her biscuits, and he ate them anyway. She stood at the counter with her back to him and told herself this meant nothing. Lucas did not warm up. She watched him try not to, the same way she was trying not to. Like mother, like son, both of them standing just outside the warmth, arms crossed, waiting for the moment it would be proved fake. He started helping with the morning feeding, not because Gideon pushed him, but because the horses required tending whether anyone felt like it or not, and Lucas was not a boy who could watch something go unmet and walk away. That was Tom in him, her late husband, right down to the stubborn chin and the inability to let a thing suffer just because helping it cost something. She'd stopped telling Lucas he looked like his father. It hurt too much, for both of them. But she watched him in the barn one Tuesday morning. She'd come looking for a tool and stopped at the doorway. Watched him forking hay into Molly's stall while Gideon worked beside him without speaking. And she saw something pass across Lucas's face that she recognized. The involuntary softening that happens when something is working and you don't want it to be working. He noticed it himself a second later. She watched him notice it, watched him put the walls back up. He looked over his shoulder as if he felt her watching, and she moved back before he could see her. She understood him. That was the thing. She understood exactly what he was doing, because she was doing it herself. The difference was that she was 30 years old, and she knew what she was protecting herself from. Lucas was 12, and he was protecting himself from hope. It was the end of the second week when it happened, the first real crack. She and Gideon were mending a stretch of fence along the east pasture, cold work, the kind where your fingers stop cooperating after 20 minutes. Nora had come with them and was sitting on the fence rail further down, kicking her feet and doing nothing particular, the way children can do nothing particular with complete contentment. Evelyn was threading wire, and her hands were numb, and she put a staple in wrong, and the wire snapped back and caught her on the side of the hand. Not badly, just a line of red across the knuckle. And she sucked in a breath, and Gideon was there before she fully processed the pain. He took her hand. Didn't ask. Just took it and looked at the cut. And then he pulled a clean handkerchief from his coat pocket, actually clean, folded, and pressed it to her hand and held it there. She looked at his hand holding hers. Then she looked at his face. He was looking at her hand. His expression was just concerned, focused, not reading anything into it. "It's fine," she said. The words came out strange. "Hold that there for a minute." "I've had worse." "I know you have," he said quietly. "Hold it anyway." She held it. Nora had turned on the fence rail and was watching them with the enormous attentiveness of an 8-year-old who is filing everything away for future analysis. Evelyn kept her eyes on the pasture and told herself it was nothing. It was just a handkerchief, and 2 minutes of her hand held steady. That was all. She couldn't remember the last time someone had just held her hand steady. She blinked hard, once, against the cold wind, and when she looked back, Gideon was already turning back to the fence, and the moment was over. She pressed the handkerchief tighter to her knuckle and thought, "You have to be careful. You have to be so careful." And she knew, even as she thought it, that she was already starting to lose. The handkerchief stayed on her bedside table that night. She didn't put it there on purpose. She'd meant to wash it and return it, and that would be the end of that. Instead, she'd set it down when she came in to check on Clara, and somewhere between checking Clara's breathing and making sure Danny hadn't kicked his blanket off again, she just left it there. Folded. Clean now. A small square of white cotton that meant nothing at all. She was still telling herself that when she fell asleep. The third week at Blackridge settled into a rhythm the way routines do when nobody plans them. Just the same needs arriving at the same times until the body starts expecting them. She was up before 5, coffee on by 5:15, and by the time Gideon came in from the first barn check, the kitchen was warm and something was on the stove. It was practical. It was her end of the arrangement. She kept telling herself that too. What she didn't account for was how the children would fill a silent house. She'd grown so used to keeping them quiet, in parking lots, in her mother-in-law's spare room, in the kinds of places where children were tolerated but not wanted, that she'd stopped noticing she was doing it. A word or a look, and they'd learned to compress themselves, take up less space, make less sound. Even Clara, who was constitutionally opposed to silence, had learned a version of indoor quiet that was really just outdoor quiet with the volume slightly turned down. At Blackridge, they started to uncompress. It happened slowly enough that she almost didn't catch it. Danny was first. Danny, who never spoke unprompted, who held the back of her cardigan in his fist in any new situation, who watched every room before he entered it. One morning, she came around the corner of the barn and found him crouched in the dirt showing Gideon something in his palm. A beetle, she saw when she got closer. Large, iridescent, the kind of thing a 6-year-old boy finds extraordinary. Gideon was crouched beside him, forearms on his knees, looking at the beetle with the same serious attention he gave to fence posts and cattle. "That's a ground beetle," he said. "They eat other bugs. Farmers like them." Danny considered this. "So it's good?" "Pretty useful, yeah." Danny closed his fingers gently around the beetle and stood up. He looked at Gideon with an expression Evelyn hadn't seen on her son's face in a very long time. Not happiness, exactly. Something quieter than that. Like finding out the world contained something reliable. He walked off toward the fence line, presumably to release the beetle somewhere suitable. Gideon stood up, noticed Evelyn standing there, and said nothing. He didn't make a thing of it, didn't do that excruciating thing some people did, the look that said, "See how good I am with your children." He just stood up and went back to what he'd been doing. That was almost worse. The performance she could have defended against. She had no defense for a man who crouched in the dirt over a beetle and didn't need anyone to watch him do it. Nora was next. Nora attached herself to the kitchen the way she attached herself to everything she found interesting. Completely, immediately, with focused intensity. She'd been standing at Evelyn's elbow in the kitchen since she was 5, asking questions about every step. And within the first week at Blackridge, she'd started doing the same thing to Gideon at dinner prep when Evelyn was still out on the property finishing afternoon work. Evelyn came in one evening to find them side by side at the counter, Nora on a step stool, both of them looking at a cutting board with deep mutual concentration. "You're going against the grain," Nora said. "I know," Gideon said. "Mama says you're supposed to go with it." "Your mama's right about most things." He turned the piece of meat and started again in the other direction. "But sometimes you cut against the grain first to see what you're working with. Then you go with it." Nora thought about this for a moment with the gravity of someone being handed significant information. "Is that a rule, or just something you do?" "Mostly, just something I do." "Okay," Nora said, and picked up a carrot and started cutting it with the small knife Evelyn recognized. Her own knife, which Nora apparently felt authorized to deploy. The cutting was cautious and deliberate and quite bad, but Gideon watched without correcting her, and the carrots ended up in the pot anyway. Evelyn stood in the doorway and felt something move through her chest that she didn't want to name. She named it anyway, privately, in the part of herself that was still honest even when honesty was inconvenient. It was grief. Not the sharp kind. The slow kind. The kind that arrives when you see something your children needed and understand how long they went without it and can't do anything about the years that are already gone. She turned around and went to wash up before anyone could see her face. Clara needed no transition period at all. By the end of the first week, she had organized her affections the way a 4-year-old organizes everything, absolutely and without reservation. Gideon was simply part of her world now. She told him things, lengthy things, about horses and beetles and the color of the sky, and a dream she'd had about a dog, even though they didn't have a dog. He listened to all of it with the same level attention he gave everything, and occasionally asked a clarifying question that made Clara laugh because it was the wrong question, and she would explain it again, and he would nod as if this made much more sense. It was effortless. That was the unbearable thing. It was effortless in a way that made Evelyn's careful management look like what it was: exhausting, relentless, and lonely. She had been the only one for 3 years, the only one who listened, who answered, who remembered what each child needed and when. She had carried it alone because there was no one else to carry it with her, and she had told herself she didn't mind, or at least that minding didn't matter because there was no alternative. And now here was an alternative. Just standing in her kitchen cutting carrots wrong, listening to her youngest daughter describe a dream about a dog. She didn't trust it, but she was starting to understand that not trusting it was not the same as not needing it. Those were two very different things, and the distance between them was where she lived. Lucas understood the distance too. He just drew it in different places. He showed up to morning feeding every day. Not because Gideon asked, and not, she suspected, because he wanted to, but because he was a boy who'd been taught to pull his weight, and he couldn't stop doing it even when he wanted to. He worked hard. Gideon told her once, in the flat, factual way he reported things, that Lucas had a natural feel for the horses and had picked up the feeding routine faster than any adult hand he'd hired. She'd made the mistake of telling Lucas that. He'd looked at her like she was trying to sell him something. "He's just saying that," Lucas said. "He doesn't say things just to say them. You've been here 3 weeks. You know that." Lucas was quiet. That was his version of acknowledgement. Not agreeing, but not arguing either. He stared at the wall for a moment and then said, "How long are we staying?" The question landed like a stone. "I don't know," she said, which was the truth, "but it's not permanent." She looked at him. At his jaw, set. At his hands, which were getting rough the way Tom's hands had gotten rough. Work-roughened, capable, 12 years old and already trying to be a man because she needed him to, and because life had made him understand that he was needed that way. "Nothing is ever guaranteed, Lucas," she said carefully. "But right now, he's going to want us to leave eventually," Lucas said. Not angry. Worse than angry. Resigned. The tone of someone who has done the math and accepted the answer before even asking the question. When the novelty wears off, that's what happens. She didn't know what to say to that, because she'd thought it herself. She was still thinking it. Every warm evening, every comfortable dinner, every moment that felt like it might be safe. Underneath it ran the same current. When does this end? "I don't know what's going to happen," she said finally. "So I can't promise you something I can't see." He nodded, once, like this confirmed something, then he went to bed. She sat at the kitchen table for a while after, in the dark, with the handkerchief she'd finally washed and never returned. She needed to return it. That was a thing she needed to do. She kept not doing it. It was a Saturday afternoon in early November when she first understood that what was happening in this house was no longer something she had full control over, and that the loss of that control was not entirely a bad thing, though she wasn't ready to say that out loud. Gideon had been repairing the hayloft ladder since morning, and she'd sent Nora out with a jar of water around 2 because she'd noticed he hadn't come in. Nora came back with the empty jar and the information that Gideon had also fixed the stuck latch on the hayloft door and found a mouse nest in the corner that he'd relocated, which Nora found both interesting and slightly sad. Around 4, the sky went the color of old pewter and the temperature dropped. She was pulling laundry off the line when she heard the first sounds from the barn. Not alarming sounds, just the specific acoustic mix of children and an adult doing something together. She finished with the laundry and walked to the barn door and looked in. All 4 of her children were in the barn. Danny and Clara were in Molly's stall. Gideon had lifted Clara up onto Molly's back, just standing still, no riding, just sitting. And Clara was gripping the mane with both fists and grinning with every tooth she had. Danny stood at Molly's head with his hand flat on her nose, very still, the way he stood when he was experiencing something he didn't want to disrupt. Nora was sitting on a hay bale with her knees pulled up, watching. Lucas was on the ladder Gideon had repaired, climbing it, not for any purpose she could identify. Just climbing it, then climbing back down, apparently testing the repair with his own body weight. Methodical, practical. So much like his father, she had to look away for a moment. "It's good," Lucas said when he reached the bottom. He said it to the ladder, or the air, or no one in particular. "Built it to hold," Gideon said. A pause. "My dad could fix anything," Lucas said. It came out without warning, she could tell. The slight shift in his posture after he said it, like the words had surprised him by existing. He didn't look at Gideon when he said it. Gideon was quiet for a moment. What was he like? Another pause. Longer. "Big," Lucas said. "Loud sometimes." He laughed a lot. He stopped. He smelled like motor oil because he was always fixing the truck. Sounds like someone worth missing. Lucas didn't answer. He put his hand on the ladder rail and looked at it instead of anything else. His throat moved. "Yeah," he said finally. That was all. Gideon didn't say anything else either. He didn't offer comfort or comparison or any of the useless things adults say when they don't know what else to do. He just went back to checking the latch hardware, and Lucas stood at the ladder, and that was the whole moment. brief and incomplete and somehow more honest than anything reassuring would have been. Evelyn pressed her back against the barn wall, outside in the cold, and did not go in. She stood there and breathed carefully until she was sure her face was neutral, and then she went back to the house. She started dinner. She didn't think about what she'd seen. She thought about the onions and the potatoes, and whether there was enough flour for biscuits, and whether she should make the biscuits now or closer to dinner. She thought about practical things. It didn't work. What Lucas had said came back. He smelled like motor oil because he was always fixing the truck. Her son had not said his father's name in 4 months. She'd stopped saying it herself because every time she said it, she watched something happen in Lucas's eyes. A flinch too small to be called a flinch, like touching a bruise accidentally. She'd learned the names of Tom's children before she learned the name of the man who'd left them. He said it to Gideon, in a barn, on a Saturday afternoon. Just said it, like the words had somewhere to go for the first time in a long time. She sliced the onion in half and stood over it for a while without cutting anything. November came in hard, the way it does in that part of the country. Not gradually, but all at once, like a door slamming. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a single night. She woke to frost on the inside of the bedroom window and Clara in the bed beside her, having migrated sometime in the small hours, warm as a coal against her side. Gideon came in from the dawn barn check with ice on his collar, and she handed him coffee before he got his coat off, which was something she'd started doing without realizing it was a habit. He took it with both hands and didn't say thank you in words, but he looked at her for a moment over the cup with an expression she'd learned to read by now. This matters. He never said that. He didn't need to. She'd spent years married to a man who said things and meant them differently, and she'd learned the hard way that what a person does is not the same as what they say. What Gideon did consistently, without announcement, was show up. For the fence, for the animals, for a 6-year-old boy with a beetle, for a ladder that needed testing. She was learning the shape of him the way you learn any landscape, slowly, by moving through it, by noting where it changed. That didn't mean she trusted it. She just noted it. The morning of November 8th, 3 days after the temperature dropped, she found the note. It was on the kitchen table, not addressed to anyone, just a piece of paper with Gideon's handwriting. Economical, slanted slightly left. The writing of someone who learned it practically rather than decoratively. Pipe under the south bathroom is going to give. I'm ordering the part. Don't run that sink until it's fixed. Underneath that, added after, a different pen. There's extra blankets in the chest in the hall closet. Second shelf. She stood at the table and read it twice. He'd thought about the blankets. In the middle of thinking about the pipe and the part and the logistics of the repair, he'd thought about whether they were warm enough and gone to the hall closet to check what was there and left a note about it. It was such a small thing. She folded the note and put it in her cardigan pocket and went to start breakfast. And she was quiet enough that when Nora came in and said, "Mama, are you okay?" she realized her expression had given something away. "I'm fine," she said. "You look sad." "I'm not sad." Nora examined her with 8-year-old precision. "You look like the kind of not sad that's actually a little sad. Go wash your hands." Nora went, satisfied that she had correctly identified the situation. Evelyn turned back to the stove and stood there for a moment with both hands on the counter, the folded note in her pocket, and she allowed herself, just briefly, just for a second, to feel the weight of what it was to be seen. Not fixed, not rescued, just noted. The way a man notes a cold night and thinks about the blankets. She'd forgotten what that felt like. Or maybe she'd never had it, not quite like this, and what she was feeling was not memory, but something stranger, the recognition of a need she hadn't known she had until it was being met. She put the coffee on and told herself to be careful. The week after, Lucas came to her at night. She was still up, which she usually was. The children's sleep was the thing that settled her, the sound of the house going quiet, and then she'd sit for a while with something warm to drink and whatever was in her head. Lucas knocked on her door frame at 9:30, which was late for him. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, which was his default posture when he had something to say and wasn't sure he should say it. "I noticed something," he said. "What?" He shifted his weight. "In the barn, there's a photo on the shelf by the tack equipment. Of a woman. She waited. I didn't ask him about it, Lucas said. But it's been there the whole time. I just noticed it. He paused. Do you think he was married? She looked at her son in the doorway and thought, he's trying to protect me. He was 12 years old and trying to assess the threat and protect her from it, and the fact that she hadn't considered this herself made her feel both grateful and ashamed. I don't know, she said honestly. Lucas nodded slowly. His jaw wasn't tight, which meant he was thinking rather than bracing. I could ask him. You don't have to. I know. He was quiet for a moment. He's not bad, Mama. It came out careful and reluctant, like a concession he'd argued himself out of and then back into. I don't think he's bad. I just don't know what he wants. She looked at her son. Her throat did something. Neither do I, she said softly. Not entirely. Lucas thought about that. Then he unfolded his arms and put one hand on the doorframe and said, Okay. Like that was enough. Like uncertainty he could stand as long as it was honest. Go to sleep, she said. Already going. He pushed off the doorframe and walked back down the hall, and she heard his door close, and the house went quiet again. She sat with her hands around her cup. A photo of a woman. A table with 5 chairs. A man who repaired ladders and thought about blankets and crouched in the dirt over a beetle. She had $31 when she arrived. She was down to 8 because she'd slipped some into the grocery money without telling him, the way she always did. The desperate arithmetic of a woman who can't afford to feel like charity. She should ask. About the woman in the photo. About what he wanted. About what this was. She should ask a lot of things. Instead, she sat in the quiet house and listened to the wind pick up outside, and the sound of it against the old wood of Blackridge was the sound of November arriving in earnest, and she pulled her cardigan tighter and thought about the extra blankets on the second shelf of the hall closet, and let herself be, just for a moment, not careful. Just a moment. Then she put her cup in the sink and went to bed. She asked about the woman in the photo on a Wednesday. She hadn't planned to. She'd been carrying the question for over a week, turning it over the way you turn over something with an edge on it, carefully, aware that it could cut. Lucas had planted it, and it had grown in the dark the way questions do when you don't let them out. It happened in the most ordinary way possible. They were in the barn after dinner, just the two of them. The children were inside. She'd left Nora nominally in charge with the specific instruction not to let Clara near the stove, and Gideon was checking one of the horse's shoes, and she was refilling the water trough, and the question just came out. There's a photograph on the shelf by the tack equipment, she said. A woman. He didn't stop what he was doing, just kept his hand on the horse's hoof and his eyes on the shoe. Yeah, he said. She waited. He set the hoof down and straightened and looked at the shelf like he'd forgotten the photo was there, which she didn't believe for a second. Her name was Margaret, he said. We were engaged 8 years ago. What happened? He was quiet for a moment. Not the evasive kind of quiet, the kind where a person is deciding how much of a true thing to say. She left, he said finally. Not because of anything dramatic. She just decided this wasn't the life she wanted. The ranch, the distance, all of it. He paused. Can't blame her for knowing what she wanted. Did you try to change her mind? Once. He picked up the brush and ran it along the horse's flank. She was right to go. She'd have been miserable out here. I'd have spent 10 years trying to make a life fit someone it didn't fit. He looked at Evelyn then, briefly. Some things don't fit no matter how much you want them to. She absorbed that. You kept her picture. I kept it because I was 28, and I thought I'd lost my one chance at any of it. He said it flatly, without self-pity, just statement of fact. After a while I stopped looking at it, and then I forgot it was there. I'm not carrying a torch, if that's what you're asking. I wasn't asking that. You were a little. She almost smiled. Almost. Maybe a little. He hung the brush back on its hook and looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated attention that she still hadn't gotten used to. The table with 5 chairs, he said. I built that 2 months after Margaret left. I was angry, and I had lumber, and I needed to do something with my hands. He paused. Stupidest thing I ever built. Too big for one person. I've been eating at one end of it for 8 years. She looked at him. That's not stupid, she said. That's just hope with bad timing. Something shifted in his face. Not much. Enough. Yeah, he said quietly. I guess it is. She went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a long time doing nothing, and when Nora asked what was wrong, she said nothing was wrong and meant it, which surprised her. Nothing was wrong. That was almost the problem. The second week of November brought the kind of cold that changes the quality of everything. The air, the light, the way sound travels. She started wearing 2 sweaters and still felt the draft through the old windows, and she'd taken to sleeping with an extra blanket over Clara and checking the others twice before she went to bed herself. Gideon had weather-stripped the worst window frames, and she hadn't asked him to, which meant he'd noticed the draft himself and done something about it. That was the thing about him. He noticed and acted without needing to be thanked or witnessed. The pipe under the south bathroom finally gave on a Tuesday night, not catastrophically, just a slow leak that had soaked through the cabinet beneath the sink and was dripping onto the floor. She found it at 5 in the morning and woke Gideon, and she stood in the doorway of his bedroom at 5 a.m. for the first time and felt the strangeness of that, the intimacy of a person's bedroom at that hour, the particular vulnerability of waking someone. And he was awake within 2 words and had the water shut off within 5 minutes and the part installed by noon. Not perfectly. The fitting leaked slightly at first, and he had to tighten it twice more before it held. But it held. She told him thank you. And he said that's what he was there for, and she thought, is it though? Is that what you are here for? A man in his mid-30s on a 40-acre ranch fixing pipes for a woman he hired 6 weeks ago and her 4 children, building tables with 5 chairs in the aftermath of loss. What was Gideon Hale there for, really? She didn't ask. She thought about asking. She didn't. Lucas asked about it instead, in his own way. He came to Gideon directly on a Thursday morning. She saw it happen through the kitchen window, the 2 of them standing by the fence, Lucas with his arms crossed the way he always stood when he was making himself vulnerable and didn't want it to show. She couldn't hear them. She watched Gideon listen with his hands in his coat pockets, nodding once or twice, and then say something that made Lucas look at the fence post for a long moment. Then Lucas nodded, single short nod, and walked away. She asked Lucas that evening what it had been about. He shrugged. Evelyn waited. I asked him what happens to us if the money runs out, Lucas said. Or if he decides he wants a regular hand, not us. She felt cold. Lucas? I needed to know. He looked at her, and he looked 12. Not 40, not the compressed version of an adult she'd been watching him become, but actually 12, which was somehow more heartbreaking than the other thing. So I asked. What did he say? Lucas was quiet for a moment. He said the money wasn't running out. He said the ranch needed what you bring to it, and he wasn't planning to change that. Another pause. And then he said, Lucas stopped. Something in his face was working. He said, what? He said that some arrangements start as business and become something else, and that he thought this might be becoming something else, but that he didn't want to put that on us before we were ready to hear it. Lucas looked at her. He said that part was up to you. Silence. He said that to you, Evelyn said. Yeah. He said it to a 12-year-old. I think, Lucas said slowly, that he was saying it to me because I'm the one who needed to hear it, not because he was making some big announcement. He paused. He's not dumb, Mama. I know he's not. Lucas unfolded his arms and put his hands in his pockets instead. A slightly less defensive posture, she noted. I still don't know if I trust him, he said, but I think he was being straight with me. He didn't give me some easy answer. He told me the actual thing. The actual thing, she repeated, that it might be becoming something else. Lucas looked at her with the exhausting directness of adolescence. Is it? She looked at her son for a long time, at his father's chin and his own eyes, not Tom's eyes, something uniquely his own, careful and watchful, and right now doing neither because he'd decided to just be here and ask. I don't know yet, she said, but you're not sure it isn't. She was quiet. Okay, Lucas said, which apparently was enough. He went back to his room. She sat at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the wood and thought about a man who told a 12-year-old boy the actual thing, and she thought about her $8, and she thought about the photograph of Margaret on the shelf, and she thought about the 5 chairs, and the extra blankets, and the fixed pipe, and the beetle crouched in Danny's palm, and she thought, be careful. Be so careful. And she knew she was already past careful, had been past it for a while, and the only question now was whether that was a disaster or a beginning. The storm changed everything. It came on the 14th of November, which she would remember exactly because it was the morning after Danny turned 7, and they'd had a small cake, and Gideon had produced a carved wooden horse from somewhere, something he'd made himself, she realized, from the marks on it. And Danny had looked at it for a long time before saying thank you in the sincere, serious way Danny said things. And Gideon had nodded like the thanks had been fully received, and that was that. The weather service had said snow. What arrived was not snow. It was a whiteout. Wind-driven, ground blizzard intensity, the kind of storm that makes the world disappear. By 8 in the morning, she couldn't see the barn from the kitchen window. The temperature was in the single digits. Gideon had been out since 6 securing things, and she'd sent Lucas after him with his coat because she couldn't stand the thought of either of them out there underdressed. They'd come back in together at 9, both of them ice-covered and red-faced, and she'd had hot food on the table without thinking about it, just doing the thing that needed doing. They spent the day inside. All of them, which was strange and close and fine. Actually, fine. Gideon repaired harness leather at the table while the children occupied themselves in their specific ways. Danny, with his carved horse and some blocks he'd arranged into an elaborate structure. Clara with a picture book she couldn't yet read but knew by heart and narrated freely. Nora with a piece of paper on which she was writing something she wouldn't show anyone. Lucas sat with his knees up in the armchair by the window, looking at the storm. She made soup. She made it too much broth, too much potato, enough for twice as many people. And she realized somewhere in the middle of it that she'd stopped cooking for survival and started cooking like a person who expected this many people to eat this many meals in this place. That was its own kind of information. Gideon looked up from the harness at one point and said, "You cook like someone expecting company." "Habit," she said. He looked at the pot. "Good habit." At some point in the afternoon, Clara climbed into the armchair beside Lucas. There was barely room for one of them, let alone both. And Lucas made room anyway, shifting over until he was practically hanging off the edge, and Clara pressed into his side and fell asleep. And Lucas sat there with his sister asleep on him, and looked at the storm with an expression Evelyn couldn't read from across the room. She looked at Gideon. He was watching Lucas and Clara too, and whatever was on his face was the same thing she felt in her chest. Something tender and complicated and cautious. He looked up and met her eyes, and neither of them said anything, and that was somehow enough of a conversation. She should have known, looking at Lucas in that armchair, that something was building in him. She'd been watching him for 3 years. She knew his weather patterns. She'd seen the way he held himself when the storm was inside rather than outside, the particular stillness that preceded him doing something she couldn't have predicted. She missed it anyway. She missed it because she was watching the wrong storm. Lucas disappeared the following morning. The blizzard had broken overnight, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt physical. She'd gotten up at 5 as usual, gone to start the coffee, looked in on the children. Danny and Clara were still asleep in the pile of blankets they'd built together. Nora was awake but reading. And she hadn't thought anything about Lucas's room being dark because he sometimes woke before her and went to the barn. She thought about it 20 minutes later when she looked out the window and the barn light wasn't on. She checked his room. Bed made. Not recently. Made the way it's made when it hasn't been slept in for several hours. His coat was gone. His boots were gone. The carved horse Danny had gotten for his birthday was sitting on Lucas's windowsill where Lucas had apparently placed it at some point. Danny's horse, in Lucas's room, which meant he'd had it, which meant he'd been thinking. She stood in the doorway of his room and felt the cold go through her like water finding the lowest point. She went for Gideon. No knock, just his name sharp outside the door. And he was there within seconds in the way he had of existing in 2 states, fully asleep and then fully present, nothing between. "Lucas is gone," she said. "His coat and boots are gone. He's been out since at least 2 or 3. She watched Gideon absorb this and saw the moment it became serious in his face. Not panic, but the focused gravity of someone calculating what's real and what has to happen. "How long?" I don't know, 2 hours minimum, maybe more. The temperature outside was 6 degrees. He was dressed and had his coat on within 3 minutes. He didn't tell her not to worry. He didn't say it would be fine. He said, I know where he goes. And when she looked at him, he said, he's been going out to the east fence line. He walks it. I've seen him. She hadn't known that her son was walking fence lines in the cold, and she hadn't known. He does it when he's working something out, Gideon said. He pulled his hat down. I'll find him. I'm coming. You need to stay with the others. She understood this was correct and hated it completely. He's my son. I know. He looked at her, and the look was direct and steady and said more than the words. I understand what you're giving me to do. I won't waste it. I'll find him, he said again. I promise you. She let him go. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him on the horse. He'd saddled Buck, who was best in snow, and she watched until the landscape swallowed him whole, which took about 90 seconds. And then she stood at the window looking at white nothing and thought about Lucas walking fence lines in the dark. She thought about his face in the armchair, the stillness, the way he'd made room for Clara without being asked, the carved horse on the windowsill. She thought about what he'd said. He's going to want us to leave eventually. That's what happens. And she thought about something else, something she'd been turning over without letting herself fully look at it. Lucas hadn't just been afraid of being left. He'd been calculating something. She felt it now, cold and clear. Her son had been adding up the equation in his particular 12-year-old way, and he'd arrived at the conclusion that the problem was him, that if there were fewer of them, specifically if there were fewer of him, the oldest, the difficult one, the one with the crossed arms and the wall and the weight, then the arithmetic would work better. Then Gideon could love a smaller family, an easier one. He hadn't run away. He'd tried to subtract himself. The understanding of it broke over her so suddenly she had to put both hands on the windowsill. She stood there for a long time. The kitchen was warm. The other children woke up in stages. First Nora, who knew immediately that something was wrong and stood with her, quiet for once. Then Danny, who sat at the table and held his carved horse without asking questions because Danny always knew when questions would make things worse. Then Clara, who did not know and wanted breakfast. And Evelyn made it, moving through the kitchen on automatic, cracking eggs without looking at them, because looking at anything too hard right now was not something she could afford. An hour passed. Nora said, He's going to find him. I know, Evelyn said. Gideon's good in the cold. He told me. He grew up in… Nora? Yeah. Just sit with me for a minute. Nora came and sat beside her at the table, and they sat together without talking, and Evelyn kept her eyes on the window and the white nothing beyond it. Another 40 minutes. Then Buck came through the white. She saw the horse first, the dark shape of him resolving out of the pale, and then Gideon, and then, in front of him on the saddle, Lucas. She was out the door before she was aware of deciding to go, in the cold without her coat, which she didn't notice until she was already at the fence. Lucas was wrapped in Gideon's coat on top of his own. He was conscious. He was shaking, the deep structural shaking of a body that has been too cold for too long. But he was conscious, and when she reached up for him, he came down into her arms, all of him, 100 pounds of cold boy who had stopped being 40 years old and was just 12 again, and he let her hold him without stiffening, without the usual courtesy brace. He gave her hugs these days. She held him, and she didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that wouldn't collapse her entirely. I'm okay, he said, into her shoulder. His voice was thin. I'm okay, Mama. I know, she said. She was not okay. She held him tighter. Over his shoulder, she looked at Gideon, who had dismounted and was standing a few feet away, giving her the space to have this moment. His face was ice-burned, cheeks raw, eyes tired. He'd been out in 6-degree weather for nearly 2 hours. He was not fine, she could see that. He was holding it together for the ride back. She mouthed, "Thank you." He shook his head once, barely, like it wasn't a thing to thank him for. She got Lucas inside and into dry clothes and wrapped in blankets by the stove, while Nora boiled water and Danny stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching with enormous eyes. And Clara, finally understanding the seriousness of the situation, sat very still on the rug and said nothing, which for Clara was an enormous act of will. Gideon came in 20 minutes later, after tending Buck, and sat heavily at the table. She put hot coffee in front of him without asking, and he wrapped both hands around it. She looked at her son in his blankets by the stove. His color was coming back. His shaking had eased. He was staring at the floor. "Lucas," she said. He looked up. "We need to talk about why you went out there." He looked at the floor again. His jaw worked. "Not right now," Gideon said quietly, from the table. His voice was level, no judgment in it. "Let him warm up first." She looked at Gideon. He was watching Lucas, not her, and his expression was the one she'd come to understand as his version of care. Not soft exactly, but present. Fully, completely present. She waited. When Lucas's hands had stopped shaking and the color was solid in his face, Gideon pushed back from the table and came and sat on the floor. Actual floor, cross-legged, so he was below Lucas's eye level where Lucas sat in the armchair. And that act alone, that physical positioning, made Evelyn hold very still. He put his elbows on his knees and looked up at Lucas. "You want to tell me?" he said. Lucas stared at him. He hadn't expected the floor. Nobody expected the floor. A long silence. "I thought if I wasn't here," Lucas started and then stopped. His throat moved. "I thought if there were only 3 of them, it'd be easier. For you, to—" He stopped again. He was looking at Gideon's face like he was waiting to be corrected. 4 kids is a lot. I know it's a lot. I figured I'm the oldest, and I'm the most... I take up the most... No, Gideon said. Lucas blinked. "That's the wrong math," Gideon said. His voice was not angry. It was something much more serious than anger. It was certain. "You want to know what I see when I count your family? I don't see 4 mouths. I don't see burdens. I see the boy who gets up at 5 to do the feeding because he can't stand to see something unmet. I see the boy who made room in an armchair for his little sister without being asked. I see the boy who asked me straight to my face what happens to his family because he was scared and he needed to know." He paused. "That's not extra weight, Lucas. That's someone worth keeping." Lucas's eyes had gone very bright. "You're not making this easier by being gone," Gideon said. "You're making it worse. You understand me? You're the piece that holds it together. I see that. Your mother sees it. Your brother and sister see it every single day, whether they know how to say it or not." Lucas said nothing. His jaw was tight in a different way now. Not bracing, but holding something in. "This ranch was empty for 8 years, Gideon said. I built a table nobody sat at. I kept a photo of a woman who left because I didn't know what else to do with all the space." He let that land. "You and your family walked through that gate and the house started making noise again. I'm not going to pretend I knew that was coming, but I know what it is now, and I know I don't want the quiet back." He looked at Lucas steadily. "Especially not because you decided to subtract yourself from the equation. You don't get to make that call." The silence in the kitchen was total. Then Lucas, 12-year-old Lucas, who hadn't cried in front of anyone since the week his father died, who had been carrying himself like a man because there was no man left to do it, put his face in his hands. Not loudly, not a collapse, just let go of something. The smallest sound, barely there, and his shoulders went forward and his hands came up. Evelyn moved from across the room without thinking, but Gideon was already there. He had a hand on Lucas's shoulder. Steady, no ceremony, just weight and presence and contact. And Lucas didn't pull away. He sat in the armchair with his face in his hands and Gideon's hand on his shoulder, and the thing that had been wound so tight in him for so long began, very slowly, to unwind. Evelyn sat on the arm of the chair on the other side and put her arm around her son, and he leaned into her, still not making much sound, just breathing in the broken way of someone releasing pressure they'd been holding for years. Danny had come into the kitchen. He stood at the edge of the room with his carved horse in his fist and his eyes wide and very careful. Clara was beside him now, her hand in his. Nora stood at the counter with her arms wrapped around herself. The kitchen was full of them, all of them, every chair full for once. Evelyn looked up at Gideon over Lucas's head. He was looking at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, his face was not composed. Not undone either. but open in the way a face goes open when it has stopped protecting itself against the possibility of something it actually wants. She looked at him for a long moment. She didn't look away. That evening, after the children were in bed, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and didn't move for a long time. The house had gone quiet in the particular way it did after something large had moved through it. Not peaceful exactly, but settled, the way air settles after a storm has passed and left the landscape rearranged. Lucas was asleep, genuinely asleep, the deep, unguarded kind she hadn't seen from him in months. She'd checked twice. His face in sleep had let go of the jaw-tightening and the watchfulness, and he looked, for the first time in a long time, like a boy his age. Gideon had gone out after dinner to do the late barn check. She heard him come back in, heard his boots on the porch, heard the particular sound of the door closing the way he always closed it, carefully, so it didn't wake anyone. She heard him hang up his coat. She heard him stop when he came into the kitchen and saw her still sitting there. He didn't say anything. He went to the stove, poured himself what was left of the coffee. It had been sitting since afternoon. It was terrible, and sat down across from her. She looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked at him. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. She'd been composing this in her head for the past 2 hours, finding the words, losing them, finding different ones. She'd had a whole architecture built for it. What came out instead was the unarchitected version. "I count my children like a debt," she said, "like something I owe the world an apology for. I have done that since before Tom died, even when things started going bad on the farm, when the money got tight, when I could see the way people looked at us. 4 kids, young, no real stability. I started saying it before anyone else could say it first, preemptive. Like if I got to the number first, then it couldn't be used against me." She paused. Gideon was still. His coffee sat untouched. "When Tom died, it got worse, because then I was the number and I was alone with it. 4 children, no husband. That was my whole identity for 3 years. Not Evelyn, not anything I'd done or anything I was. Just 4 kids and no husband, showing up to every door I knocked on and watching the math happen on people's faces." She swallowed. "I got so used to it that I stopped being surprised by it. I just started doing it myself, leading with it, getting it over with." "And then you showed up here," Gideon said. "And then I showed up here," she said. "And you said I'd miscounted." He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. "When did Tom die?" 3 years ago, March. He had a heart problem he didn't know about. He was 34. She said it the way she'd learned to say it, at a certain distance, the information delivered without the full weight of it, because the full weight of it was not something you could carry into every conversation. "He was out in the field. He was alone. By the time I found him..." She stopped, started again. "The children don't know the details. They know he went fast." Which is true. It was fast. Gideon said nothing. Not because he didn't have anything to say. She'd learned by now that his silences were not empty, but because he understood that this part needed room. "After, I tried to hold the farm together. 3 months, maybe 4. But without him bringing in anything, and with 4 children, and the debt we had on the equipment," she shook her head. "It wasn't going to work, and I knew it wasn't going to work, and I stayed anyway because leaving felt like admitting he'd left me with nothing, and I wasn't ready to admit that." "He left you with 4 kids, Gideon said. "That's not nothing." She looked at him. "I know that," she said softly. "I know it now. At the time it felt like..." She stopped. "At the time the kids felt like the thing that made everything harder. I'm not proud of that. But it was true. Every decision I had to make was weighted by 4 children. Every door that closed on me closed harder because of them. And I loved them every second of it. I never resented them. I need you to understand that. But loving them and feeling like they were making my life impossible were not mutually exclusive things. They existed at the same time." She watched Gideon's face to see if that landed wrong. It didn't. He was just listening, the way he listened to everything, like it deserved his full attention. "After I left the farm, I lived with Tom's mother for 8 months, she said. Ruth, she's not a bad person. She was grieving too, but she tried to find the right word. Opinions. About how I was managing the children. About the decisions I'd made. About Tom." She paused. "She blamed me, a little. Not directly. The way people blame you sideways, with small comments and pointed silences. Like if I'd been better at something, he'd still be here. I don't think she knew she was doing it. But you knew. I knew every single time. She looked at her hands again. 8 months of that, and then I took my $800 from the savings account, which was everything, and I put the children in the car and I drove until I saw a classified ad that didn't make me feel like I was already turned away before I knocked. Gideon was quiet for a moment. What made this one different? She thought about it honestly. It said honest work for honest pay. It didn't list requirements. It didn't ask for experience letters or references or a whole presented version of myself that I had to manufacture. She paused. It just said honest work, and I thought, I can do honest work. That's the one thing I know I can do. He nodded slowly. I showed up here expecting you to turn me away, she said. That's the truth. I led with the children because I'd learned that the sooner I said it, the sooner I could stop waiting for the moment you'd say it yourself. And you... She stopped. Said you'd miscounted, he finished. Said I'd miscounted. She looked at him. I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't always know what to do with it, because the part of me that's been building walls for 3 years doesn't just stop because someone opens a gate. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Can I tell you something? Yes. He looked at the table, and she watched him decide how much of the true thing to say. The same calculation she'd seen him make before, and she'd learned that when he finished making it, what came out was always the whole thing. My father had this ranch before me, he said. He built the original barn. First generation out here, broke land that didn't want to be broken. He was not... He stopped. Started again with a different word. He was not an easy man. He believed in work the way other people believe in something religious. Everything earned, nothing given, no exceptions, and that included his own children. She was still. I have a brother, James, younger. He left when he was 16 and I haven't heard from him in 14 years. He said it flat, like a fact he'd long since accepted. My father told him when he left that he could stay gone. He did. And you stayed, Evelyn said. I stayed because the land needed tending and because I didn't know how to be anything else. He looked up at her. Not because I wanted to, not for the first several years. I stayed because leaving felt like James winning something, which was stupid, and I knew it was stupid, and I stayed anyway. He paused. My father died when I was 27. Heart, like Tom. Different. He'd had years of warnings and ignored them all, which was the most like him thing he could have done. By the time he went, I had the ranch and the debt and nothing else. No family left, she said. No family left. He picked up the coffee, looked at it, set it back down. I built the table 2 months later. I told you it was because of Margaret, and that was part of it. But honestly, it was mostly because the house felt so large. After years of filling it with my father's presence, which was substantial whether or not it was warm, and then all at once, nothing, just rooms. He looked at the table's surface. I built it too big on purpose. I knew it was too big. I built it that way because I needed to believe someone was going to sit at it. Evelyn looked at the table between them. Round, solid, dark wood, 5 chairs. 8 years, she said. 8 years. He met her eyes. I kept the ranch running. I bought the cattle up from 20 head. I expanded the fence line. I did all the practical things that needed doing. A pause. And I ate at one end of a table that sat 5 and tried not to count the empty chairs. The kitchen was very quiet. We're a matched pair, Evelyn said. You were adding empty chairs. I was subtracting children. Something moved across his face, not a smile, but close to what came before one, the softening that happened at the corners. Different math, same problem, he said. What's the problem? He looked at her for a moment. Doing the arithmetic wrong, he said quietly. Treating people like numbers instead of like what they actually are. She held his gaze. Outside, the wind had picked up again, the remnant edge of the storm coming back around. The house creaked at the joints the way old houses do when weather presses against them. Lucas is going to be all right, she said. It was half statement and half question. Yes, Gideon said without hesitation. He's got more backbone than he knows. He just needed to know it was safe to put it down for a minute. She thought about her son's face in his hands, the sound he'd made, the way he'd leaned. "Thank you for sitting on the floor," she said. Gideon looked slightly confused. "What?" "When you talked to him. You sat on the floor so you were below his eye level." She paused. "That's not something most people think to do." He seemed to consider whether he'd done it on purpose. "I just didn't want him to feel cornered," he said. "I know." She looked at him. "That's what I mean." He was quiet for a moment, then, "He's a good kid, Evelyn. He's been carrying things that were never his to carry, and he's done it without complaining and without dropping any of it. That's not a difficult child. That's a remarkable one." She felt it land in her chest, the way a true thing lands when you've been waiting to hear it confirmed. She'd known it, but she'd been the only one saying it for so long that she'd started to doubt her own assessment. "He looks like Tom," she said, "around the jaw, and the way he goes still when he's thinking." "Tell me about Tom." She looked at him. Nobody had asked her that in a long time. Sorry about Tom. Not Tom must have been wonderful. Just tell me about him." "He was loud," she said, echoing Lucas's words from the barn without meaning to. "He took up space in a room, not in a bad way, in the way that made a room feel more inhabited. He laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them, which should have been annoying and somehow wasn't." She paused. "He was stubborn. He would not let a problem go until he'd solved it, which was useful on a farm and drove me insane everywhere else." She smiled, the kind that arrives without permission. "He once spent 4 hours trying to fix a kitchen faucet that a plumber could have sorted in 20 minutes, just because he didn't want to admit the faucet had beaten him." Gideon almost smiled. "Did he fix it?" "Eventually, yes. With a rubber band and something he'd found in the barn that I have never been able to identify." She shook her head. "He was so proud of himself." "Sounds like someone worth missing," Gideon said. The same words he'd said to Lucas in the barn, back when Lucas had said his father smelled like motor oil. She looked at him, and her throat went tight. "Yeah," she said. "He really was." She didn't cry. She'd cried about Tom in private, in bathrooms, in the car with the radio turned up loud enough that the children couldn't hear through their headphones. She didn't cry in kitchens or in front of people or in situations where she needed to keep going, which was all situations. But her eyes went wet for just a second, and she let that happen because she was too tired to manage it away. Gideon didn't look away from her. He didn't offer anything useless. He just let it be there. After a moment, she said, "He would have liked you." The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise him. "Tom," she said, "he would have. He had strong opinions about people. He made up his mind fast, and he was usually right. He would have looked at you and said something like," she thought about it. "He would have said, 'That man doesn't waste anything.' That was his highest compliment." Gideon was very still. "I thought you should know," she said. "I don't know why. I just thought you should." He looked at the table for a moment. When he looked back up, his expression was open in the way it had been in the kitchen that afternoon, watching Lucas, watching her. The careful composure was still there, but something behind it had shifted. "I need to ask you something," he said. Her heart did something. Not a lurch, something more like a settling, a weight finding its center. "Okay. What I said to Lucas, that some arrangements become something else." He paused. "I don't want to put that on you before you're ready. Lucas asked me a straight question, and I gave him a straight answer, but I should have talked to you first, and I didn't, and that wasn't right." "What were you going to say?" she asked. "If you had come to me first." He was quiet for a moment. The wind pressed against the window. "I was going to say that I'm not interested in this being an arrangement," he said. "I'm interested in this being a life, mine and yours and all four of them, and I know that's a significant thing to say, and I know you've got reasons to be careful, and I'm not asking you to stop being careful." He held her gaze. "But I needed you to know that when I put out that classified ad, I wasn't looking for a ranch hand. I didn't know what I was looking for. And then you showed up with your children and your $31 and your chin up and told me the number before I could ask. And I thought," he stopped. What? She said. I thought, she's used to people running the math and coming up short, and I wanted to be the thing that didn't do that. Evelyn sat with that for a long moment. This isn't simple, she said. I have 4 children who are just starting to trust something again. If that trust gets broken, I know. Lucas especially. If Lucas, I know, he said again, and the repetition was not dismissive. It was him acknowledging the full weight of it, not trying to move past it. I'm not asking you to decide tonight. I'm not asking you to decide anything. I'm telling you where I stand so you can make whatever decision you make with the full picture. She looked at him across the table, at the man who had sat on the floor, who built a table for people who hadn't arrived yet, who remembered extra blankets in the middle of thinking about a broken pipe, who told a 12-year-old boy the actual thing. My mother-in-law called last week, she said. This was a non sequitur, and she knew it. She said it anyway. Ruth. She wanted to know where we were. I told her we'd found work. She asked if I was keeping the children in school, which, yes, they're doing schoolwork here, Nora especially. I've been going through the curriculum with her. She stopped. Ruth said she'd been speaking to her pastor and a social worker friend of hers about my situation. Gideon's eyes sharpened slightly. What does that mean? It means she's been telling people that the children are living in an unstable situation. It means she may be building a case for something I don't want to think about. She said it steadily because it had to be said steadily. She didn't threaten anything directly. Ruth doesn't do things directly. She presents concern. She lets other people draw conclusions. She paused. She loves the children. I believe that. But she's also never quite forgiven me for taking them away. Away from her, you mean? Away from the version of Tom's family she wanted to keep intact. I was always adjacent to that, allowed in because Tom chose me. After he died, the permission got narrower. Gideon was quiet for a moment. His jaw had set in a way she hadn't seen before. Not the bracing she recognized from Lucas, something older. The set of a man encountering something unjust and calculating what to do about it. What does she want? He said. I don't know exactly. I think she wants the children near her. I think she believes she could provide more stability than I can. Evelyn kept her voice level. She might be building toward a formal challenge, custody, or something like it. I don't know how serious it is. Does she know where you are? She knows we're working on a ranch. She doesn't have an address. She paused. Yet. Gideon looked at her. If she pursues something formal, a stable home, consistent income, the children enrolled in proper school. I know what it would need to look like, Evelyn said quietly. I've been doing that math too. A different kind of silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. Dense. The way air gets when everything important has been put on the table and both people are looking at it. This changes the shape of things, Gideon said. I'm not telling you because I want you to solve it, she said quickly. I'm telling you because you told me where you stand and She stopped. I think you should have the full picture too. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I told you I wanted this to be a life, not an arrangement. He paused. That doesn't change because it got complicated. It was always complicated. I know. I was always going to be here anyway. She looked at him, at the rough, certain, imperfect face of a man who had built a table for people he didn't know yet, and then waited 8 years to meet them. I'm scared, she said. It came out simply because she was too tired to wrap it in anything. I know, he said. I have been scared for 3 years, and I'm so tired of it. I know that too. She looked at her hands. One of them was still faintly marked from the fence wire a few weeks ago. The small scar had faded, but she knew where it was. She thought about impressing a handkerchief to it without asking, without making it a thing. The photograph of Margaret, she said. He looked at her steadily. I think you should take it down, she said. Not because I'm asking you to, because you said you forgot it was there. Things you forget about shouldn't stay up. He considered that. You're right, he said simply. She nodded and felt something shift slightly, some small internal configuration adjusting to accommodate the shape of this, of him agreeing with her, of the fact that she'd said it and he'd heard it and nothing had broken. The coffee between them had gone cold. The wind against the window had settled into a low, constant sound. The house creaked once, long and slow, and then went still. "I should go to bed," she said. "Yeah." She stood up. He stood up. They were across a table from each other, the round table, the table with 5 chairs, and neither of them moved toward the other and neither of them moved away, and that staying in place felt like its own kind of statement. "Gideon," she said. "Yeah. The thing you said, about wanting this to be a life." She looked at him. "I haven't decided anything. I need you to understand that." "I understand that. But I'm not opposed to it." She said it carefully, feeling each word before she committed to it. "The idea of it, I'm not opposed to it." He looked at her, and the expression on his face was not triumph or relief or anything easy. It was just quiet. The way someone looks when something they've been cautious about turns out to be real. "That's enough," he said. "For right now, that's enough." She went to bed. She lay in the dark with Clara warm beside her, and she looked at the ceiling and thought about Tom. And she thought about the arithmetic of loss and how long she'd been doing it wrong. And she thought about a man who built a table too big on purpose because he needed to believe in the people who hadn't arrived yet. She thought, Tom would have said he doesn't waste anything. She thought, he's right. He doesn't. She fell asleep before she finished the thought, which was the first time in 3 years she'd fallen asleep before finishing any thought at all. Because usually her mind kept working long after her body had given out, running numbers, checking locks, counting children. This time she just stopped. Outside, the wind moved across the 40 acres of Blackridge Ranch, across the fence lines and the frozen pasture and the barn where 3 horses stood in the specific reliable warmth of animals in winter, and the house was full of the sounds of people sleeping, all 5 chairs occupied and all 5 people in them accounted for and safe. 2 mornings later, she went to the shelf by the tack equipment in the barn, and the photograph of Margaret was gone. She didn't say anything about it, and neither did he. She didn't need to. Ruth's letter arrived the following week, formal and careful the way Ruth did everything, with one line buried in the middle that had the shape of a threat wearing the clothes of concern. "I have spoken with an attorney friend about the children's welfare, and there are options worth discussing if their current situation is not providing the stability they deserve." Evelyn read it twice at the kitchen table. Then she put it face down and went out to where Gideon was working and stood beside him for a moment without saying anything. He looked at her. "Letter?" "Letter." He straightened from what he was doing. She handed it to him without explanation, and he read it, and she watched his face. And what she saw there was exactly what she'd said to herself 2 nights ago. He doesn't waste anything. He didn't waste anger on it. He didn't waste reassurance. He read it, and he folded it, and he handed it back, and he said, "We should talk to someone in town about your rights and what she can actually do." "I can't afford a lawyer." "I know people," he said. "Let me make some calls." She looked at him. "This isn't your problem." He looked at her with the direct, steady look she had finally, completely stopped defending herself against. "You told me 2 nights ago you weren't opposed to the idea of this being a life," he said. "If that's where we're going, then Ruth's letter is my problem." He paused. "Is that still where we're going?" She held his gaze. The cold was sharp and the sky was a flat white, and somewhere behind them she could hear Clara calling for someone, probably Nora, about something probably minor. "Yes," she said, "that's still where we're going." He nodded, once the way he nodded when something had been settled. "Then let me make some calls," he said, and turned back to his work. And that was all. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, in the cold, looking at the back of his canvas coat, and she felt something she didn't have a name for yet. Something that was not quite relief and not quite happiness, but was in the same territory. The feeling of ground that holds your weight when you step on it. The feeling of something real. She went back inside and started lunch, and the house was full of sound, and she didn't count anything. Gideon made his calls the next morning. She didn't ask who he was calling. She heard him on the phone in the hallway in the early afternoon, his voice low and even, and she caught fragments, family situation, formal challenge, what grounds would she actually have? And she kept herself in the kitchen and didn't hover, because hovering was not something she did, and because she needed to believe she could trust him to handle it without needing to oversee every word. That was its own kind of progress. He came in afterward and sat down and told her what he'd learned. His contact was a man named Aldridge, who did family law out of the county seat. Not a friend exactly, but someone who owed Gideon a conversation, and the conversation had been useful. Ruth had no automatic standing. She was a paternal grandmother, which carried weight in some circumstances and very little in others. The phrase unstable situation in a letter carried no legal force on its own. What would matter, if Ruth pursued anything formal, was the actual condition of the children, their health, their schooling, their living circumstances, the stability of their home. So what she's really threatening, Evelyn said, is an inspection. Essentially, Gideon said, and we don't have anything to hide. She looked at him. We have a lot to explain. Explaining isn't the same as hiding. That was true, and she knew it was true, and it still sat uneasily because explaining required a narrative, and she wasn't sure yet what the narrative of Blackridge Ranch was. A widow and her 4 children working for a rancher. A living arrangement that had become something else, something that didn't have clean edges yet. Aldridge said the fastest way to establish stability is documented consistency, Gideon said. School records, health records, proof of permanent residence. He paused, and a clear picture of the household. What does that mean? He looked at her steadily. It means what you think it means. She was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was warm, and the light through the window was the thin, pale light of late November, and she could hear Danny somewhere in the house talking to his carved horse in the low, murmuring way he did, narrating whatever drama the horse was currently involved in. You're not proposing something because of Ruth's letter, she said. It was not quite a question. No, he said. I'm noting that what I said 2 nights ago and what the situation now requires happen to be the same thing. He held her gaze. I know the difference. I need you to know I know it. She did know. That was the thing about having spent weeks learning the shape of him. She knew when he was being strategic and when he was being straight, and these were not the same face. I need time, she said. You have it. She nodded and stood up and went to the window and looked at the thin winter light on the frozen ground and thought, how much time do I actually have? Not an unlimited amount. Ruth would not wait forever. Winter was pressing in. The children were settled in a way they hadn't been in 3 years, and disrupting that settlement was not something she was willing to do. She turned around. Ask me properly, she said. Not because of Ruth, not because of Aldridge. Ask me like you mean it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood up from the table, and he didn't do anything theatrical, didn't drop to a knee or produce anything from a pocket. He just stood there across the kitchen and said, Evelyn Harper, I'm asking you to marry me. Not to solve a problem and not to fill a role, because this house has been mine and empty for 8 years, and now it's ours and full, and I don't want it to go back to what it was. He paused. And because I think you're the most capable and the most stubborn and the most honest person I've ever met, and I would like to spend a long time in proximity to all 3 of those things. She looked at him. Stubborn, she said. Considerably. You're not wrong, she said. She said yes. Not dramatically. She said it the way she did most things, quietly, directly, without decorating it. Yes. And he crossed the kitchen, and he held her face in both hands, careful as a man holding something he knows the value of, and kissed her once, and that was it. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. Clara walked in approximately 45 seconds later, wanting to know if there were crackers, took one look at them, announced, "You're kissing," and walked back out again with the crackers she'd located herself. Evelyn laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere you forgot was there. Gideon made a sound that was definitely a laugh, which she hadn't heard from him before in full. And it was a good sound, lower than she'd expected, slightly surprised at itself. 4 kids, she said when she could. 5 chairs, he said. They told the children that evening after dinner. She had thought about the order of things, whether to tell Lucas first, privately, whether to have some structured conversation with all of them. And then she thought, Gideon sat on the floor. He told Lucas the actual thing, and she thought that what these children needed most was to not be managed through important information. They'd been managed enough, so she just told them at the table, after the plates were cleared. She said that she and Gideon were going to get married, and that they were going to stay at Blackridge, and that this was their home now. Clara's response was immediate and logistical. "Can I have a dog now?" Danny looked at his plate for a moment, then looked at Gideon, then nodded with the gravity of someone who has weighed something carefully and found it acceptable. It was the most Danny response imaginable, and Evelyn loved him for it completely. Nora started crying, happy crying, the kind that embarrassed her immediately. She pressed her hands to her face and said, "I'm not sad, I'm not sad." And Evelyn reached across the table and took her hands down and held them and said, "I know, baby, I know." Lucas said nothing for a long moment. Everyone at the table was quiet, because everyone at the table understood that Lucas's silence was the one that mattered most, and crowding it would be the wrong thing. He was looking at Gideon, not with the old watchful assessment, the crossed-armed suspicion she'd watched him carry for weeks. He was just looking, working something out. Then he said, "Are you going to adopt us?" Evelyn's throat closed. Gideon didn't flinch from the question. "That's something we could talk about," he said. "If that's what you want. It's not something I'd do without you telling me it's what you want." Lucas thought about this. What would it mean? "It would mean legally, I'm your father," Gideon said. "It doesn't change anything about Tom. It doesn't replace him. It just means on paper and in practice, you're mine to look after." Lucas looked at the table, then back up. "Can I think about it?" "You can take as long as you need," Gideon said. Lucas nodded. The quiet settled. And then, carefully, he reached across the table and picked up the last biscuit from the plate in the center, the one everyone had been politely not taking, and ate it, and something in the room exhaled. Clara said, "So can I have a dog?" The wedding was small. She hadn't wanted large, and he hadn't suggested it. They went to the county courthouse on the second Friday of December with the children dressed in the best they had, which was not much but pressed and clean, and Nora had put her hair up in a way she'd taught herself from a book and looked approximately 30 years old, and Danny's collar was slightly crooked and kept being straightened by Lucas, who was wearing his father's old watch because Evelyn had kept it and had given it to him that morning without ceremony, just placed it in his palm and said, "Your dad would want you to have it today." Lucas had looked at the watch for a long time and put it on and not said anything, but had stood a little straighter the rest of the morning. Clara wore her red dress and had opinions about everything. The ceremony was brief and legal and had no particular poetry to it, which suited them both. There was a judge and 2 courthouse clerks as witnesses, and at one point Clara asked loudly when the party was, and one of the clerks laughed, and Evelyn felt the laugh go through her like warmth. Gideon held her hand through the whole thing, not tightly, just held it, with the steady particular pressure of a man who means what he does. When it was done, they drove back to the ranch, and she made the biggest dinner she'd made yet. Not to mark the occasion, just because there were people to feed, and feeding them was the thing she knew how to do. And they ate together at the round table, all 5 chairs, and everyone filled, and it was loud in the way that table had never been loud before, and Evelyn looked around at it. At Danny, with his horse tucked in his pocket, at Clara already negotiating the dog question with Gideon, at Nora, who was watching everything with her writer's eyes and filing it away, at Lucas, who was cutting his food and wearing his father's watch, and who looked up and caught Evelyn looking at him and gave her a small private nod. She had to look down at her plate for a moment. Just a moment. Ruth came in January, unannounced, which was its own kind of statement. Evelyn saw the car from the kitchen window and felt the familiar cold move through her, and then she took a breath and went to the door and opened it before Ruth had finished walking up the porch steps. Ruth was 61 and had Tom's coloring and a way of holding herself that was very straight and very controlled, and which Evelyn had spent 8 months in the same house with and never quite decoded. She looked at Evelyn on the porch, and then her eyes went past Evelyn to the house behind her, and then to the yard where Danny was visible near the barn, and her face did something complicated. "You should have told me where you were," Ruth said. "You should have asked instead of consulting attorneys," Evelyn said. Ruth's mouth tightened. She was not accustomed to Evelyn being this direct. Previously, Evelyn had been diplomatic with her, careful, managing, all the things she'd been with everyone when she still believed she had to earn her right to take up space. "I came to see the children," Ruth said. "You can see the children," Evelyn said. "Come in." She stepped back and let her in, and Ruth walked into the house and stopped in the hallway and looked at it. At the coats on the hooks, 5 of them now, and the boots lined up below, and the sound of Nora somewhere upstairs and Clara's voice carrying from the kitchen. And something moved across her face that Evelyn didn't expect. She looked tired, old in a way she hadn't looked 8 months ago. She looked like a woman who had been holding something rigid for a long time and wasn't sure she could keep holding it. The children came. Clara first, because Clara always came first, and she threw her arms around Ruth's waist without preamble, because Clara loved people the way she loved everything, completely and without conditions, which was her greatest quality and also the one that most terrified Evelyn, because the world was not built to deserve it. Ruth held her, and her face went soft in a way Evelyn recognized. This was a woman who genuinely loved these children. That had never been the question. Danny came next, more carefully, but he let Ruth hug him, and he patted her arm with 2 pats, which was Danny's version of warmth, and Ruth seemed to understand this. Nora came down the stairs and said, "Hi, Grandma Ruth," with the measured politeness she deployed when she was uncertain about something. Lucas came last. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at his grandmother with an expression Evelyn couldn't fully read, something careful and old and 12 years old all at the same time. "Hey, Grandma," he said. Ruth looked at him, and her eyes went wet, fast, the way eyes go wet when you see something you love that you're afraid you've lost. "You look like your father," she said. Her voice was not steady. "I know," Lucas said. He crossed the hallway and let her hug him, and his arms went around her back, and Evelyn watched her son hold his grandmother. And she thought, he knows. He knows she loves them. That's why he's doing it. Not because he's forgiven the letter, but because he understands that love and bad judgment are not mutually exclusive. He'd learned that watching his mother, probably. Watching all of them. Gideon came in from outside when Ruth had been there about 20 minutes. He took his hat off at the door. She'd never seen him do that before. It was an old-fashioned courtesy that no one practiced anymore. And said Mrs. Sutton, and shook Ruth's hand and didn't offer anything beyond that, just was present and solid and calm. Ruth looked at him with Tom's eyes for a long moment, the assessment of a woman deciding whether to trust something. "The children look well," she said finally. "They're good kids," Gideon said. Another pause. "The house is warm," she said. It was an odd thing to say, and it wasn't really about the temperature. "Old houses hold heat if you seal them right," Gideon said. "Took me 2 winters to get this one right." Ruth looked at him a moment longer, then she looked at Evelyn. Something passed across her face, the thing that had been rigid in her for months. Evelyn could see it shifting, not breaking, not gone, but moving. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Ruth said. "I know," Evelyn said. She meant it. "The letter was—" Ruth stopped. "I was frightened. I thought I was losing all of them." The last of Tom. "You're not losing them," Evelyn said carefully. "They're not going anywhere, neither am I." She paused. "But I need you to understand that this is their home now. This is my home, and the decisions about my children are mine to make." Ruth looked at her. The straightness didn't leave her spine, but something in her eyes conceded. "I understand that," she said, quietly, like a woman who has argued herself to the end of something and arrived at a place she didn't want to be but can't argue past. She stayed for 3 hours. She ate lunch with them at the round table. 6 people now around a table for 5. Danny's chair pulled in close, and one of the kitchen stools pressed into service, because that's what happens when the table isn't quite big enough anymore. She talked to the children about Tom, the way grandmothers can talk about their sons, with a different angle on the same life, the stories Evelyn didn't have, the boy he'd been before he was the man she knew. Lucas listened to all of it with his arms unfolded, which she noted. He asked questions, real ones. When Ruth left, she hugged each child twice, and she shook Gideon's hand again, and she looked at Evelyn on the porch and said, He built you a good house." "He did," Evelyn said. Ruth looked at the house for a moment. At the seals on the windows, probably. At the firewood stacked neatly along the porch wall, enough to last the winter. At the boots inside the door. At the sound of Clara already back in motion somewhere inside. Tom would have... She stopped. Started again. "Tom would have wanted them to be warm," she said. Her voice broke on the last word, just slightly, and she pressed her lips together and pulled herself back. "That's all I wanted. I just wanted them to be warm." Evelyn looked at her and felt something she hadn't expected. Compassion. Clean, uncomplicated compassion for a woman who had lost her son and then lost her grip on everything connected to him, who had handled that loss badly and did not entirely know it, who loved these 4 children with a fierceness that had expressed itself wrongly. "They're warm, Ruth," she said. "I promise you, they're warm." Ruth nodded once, tight, and went to her car, and Evelyn watched her drive down the road until she was gone. She stood on the porch alone for a minute. The cold was sharp and clear, and the sky had gone the pale winter blue that comes after storms when the air is scoured clean. She felt Gideon behind her before she heard him. He put his coat around her shoulders from behind. Not his arms, just the coat, because she was in her cardigan and the cold was serious. And stood at the door. "Okay?" he said. "Yeah," she said. She was, actually. "She's not going to pursue anything." "No," he agreed. "She's not." She just wanted to see that they were warm. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to keep in contact with her?" She thought about it honestly. About the 8 months in the spare room. About the sideways blame and the pointed silences. About Lucas in the hallway letting Ruth hold him because he understood that love and bad judgment could live in the same person. "Probably," she said. "She's their grandmother. She's the last piece of Tom's family." She paused. "She needs to know they're okay. She'll be better from a distance." "Most people are," Gideon said. She almost laughed. "That's very wise or very cold?" "Both, maybe." She pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders and looked at the winter sky and felt the strange lightness of a thing being finished. Not perfectly, not without residue, but finished. Ruth was not an enemy and had never been one, just a frightened person who had expressed fear badly, and the threat had dissolved not through force, but through the simple visibility of a warm house and a table that held everyone and children who were, plainly, all right. Winter turned. Not quickly. Winter never turns quickly in that country. But there was a morning in late February when the light came through the kitchen window at a different angle and held more warmth than it had the day before, and Evelyn stood at the stove and felt it on her face and thought, "Spring is coming. Not yet, but coming." Lucas turned 13 in March. She asked him what he wanted for his birthday, and he said, with 12-year-old about to be 13-year-old casualness that didn't quite hide what he meant. "Can we get a dog? Claire's been asking for months, and I think Danny would like it too." He was using his siblings as cover, and she loved him for it. They got a dog. A ranch dog, not a lap dog. A young border collie mix Gideon knew about from a family outside of town. Black and white and completely ridiculous. Incapable of stillness. Immediately named Pepper by Clara without any consultation. Pepper did not understand the concept of personal space and had opinions about every activity and was exactly, completely wrong for a working ranch, and exactly, completely right for a house full of children. Danny loved Pepper with a specificity and focus that was entirely Danny. He'd decided Pepper was his responsibility and carried out that responsibility with the same seriousness he brought to everything. He made a chart of feeding times. He researched what border collies needed. He presented his findings to Gideon at the kitchen table, 1 page, handwritten, and Gideon read it straight through and said, "Good thinking." And Danny looked at the table and tried not to show that this was the best thing that had happened to him in weeks. Spring came properly in April. The ranch woke up in the specific way ranches do after winter. Everything at once, everything urgent, the ground soft and the cattle restless, and the fence line that always suffered in the freeze needing attention. She worked alongside Gideon in the early mornings, the children in school now, properly enrolled in the county school, A 40-minute bus ride each way that they treated as an adventure, and that Evelyn treated as 40 minutes of her heart existing outside her body, which she accepted because that was the permanent condition of being a parent. Lucas had changed over the winter in ways that were incremental individually and significant in total. He was taller, which was the obvious thing, but he carried himself differently. Not the compressed adult boy she'd been watching since Tom died, not the 12-year-old trying to be 40. Something closer to what he actually was, a boy of 13 who was learning to inhabit that age without apologizing for it. He got into a fight at school in April over something he was unwilling to fully explain, and when she sat him down about it, he said, "The other kid was being stupid about something, and I shouldn't have hit him, but I don't completely regret it," which was the most honest accounting of a fight she'd ever heard. Gideon talked to him about it after, also at the kitchen table, also in the direct way he had. She didn't listen this time. She trusted it. That was its own kind of change in her, the trust. Not naive, not without attention, but real. The ongoing practice of not waiting for the other shoe because the other shoe had not dropped in months, and the man wearing it was not a man who dropped shoes on people. She'd started being able to feel good things without immediately auditing them for what was wrong. That was slow work. Some days she caught herself tallying the good against the bad, the stable against the fragile, the reasons to worry against the evidence of okay. Old habit, deeply grooved. But the tally was shifting. The reasons to worry got smaller not because life was perfect. The south fence needed replacing, and there had been a sick calf in March that hadn't made it, and money was not abundant, and sometimes she and Gideon said the wrong things to each other and had to find their way back. But because the foundation underneath all of it held, consistently, without drama, without requiring performance, she'd started to believe in the foundation. In May, Lucas asked Gideon if they could talk. She didn't eavesdrop this time either. She knew what it was about, or thought she knew. And she understood that if she was right, this was a conversation that needed to happen without her in it. They were out by the east fence line for almost 2 hours. When they came back, Lucas went to his room and she couldn't read his face, and Gideon came to the kitchen and she said, "Well," and he said, "He asked about the adoption." Her heart moved. What did he say? He said he'd been thinking about it since December. He said he didn't want to lose his dad's name, Tom's name, and he wanted to know if that was possible. Gideon paused. I told him we could look at options, that it didn't have to be all or nothing. What does he want? He wants... Gideon stopped, looked at her. His face was doing the open thing again, the thing she'd stopped being surprised by and had started being grateful for. He said he wants me to be his father, in practice, in the ways that count. Another pause. He said he's been calling me Gideon, and he'd like to stop doing that. Evelyn stood very still. He asked if it would be all right, Gideon said, if he called me something else. She couldn't speak for a moment. She looked at her husband. Her husband. She was still becoming accustomed to the word, still surprised sometimes by the rightness of it. And she thought about the boy in the blizzard who had tried to subtract himself from the equation. The boy who had sat on the fence at the gate that first day with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, bracing for the math to come up wrong again. What did you say to him? She managed. I said it would be more than all right, Gideon said. I said it's what I'd been hoping for. She nodded. She pressed her lips together and nodded again. He's still in his room, Gideon said. She went. She knocked, and Lucas said, "Come in," and he was sitting on his bed with the carved horse, Danny's carved horse, which he'd placed on his windowsill months ago and which had just stayed there because nobody had suggested it move, and he was turning it in his hands. She sat beside him on the bed. He looked at her, his father's jaw, his own eyes. "You okay?" she said. "Yeah." He turned the horse over. "You're not upset? That I want to..." Lucas. She waited until he looked at her. "Your dad is your dad. Nothing changes that. Nothing should change that." She paused. "And Gideon is also..." She stopped, found the right word. "Gideon is the man who rode into a blizzard for you. He gets to be something too. Both things are true." Lucas looked at the horse in his hands. "I know. I just didn't want you to think I was..." "I don't," she said. He nodded, quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm going to call him Pa." He said it simply, like he'd decided it a while ago. "Not Dad. That stays with my dad. But Pa, that's different." She thought about the word, the plainness of it, the frontier practicality of it. "That's perfect," she said. He looked relieved in the way teenagers look relieved when an adult confirms something they already knew was right. Not like they needed permission, but like they needed the company of agreement. She put her arm around him and he let her, which he did more easily now than he had in a long time. And they sat there on his bed with the carved horse between them and the spring light coming through the window and the sound of Pepper somewhere below them doing something probably inadvisable near the kitchen. The following October, Evelyn discovered she was pregnant. She sat with it for 3 days before she told Gideon. Not because she was afraid of his reaction. She knew his reaction. She knew him. She'd known him for a year now, and she could read his face the way she read the land. But because she needed 3 days with it herself, to feel the shape of it, to understand that this was not a complication or a problem or an additional number to add to the burden she'd spent years believing she was. This was something else, something chosen, arrived at, the natural consequence of a life that had become real. She told him on a Sunday morning when the children were still asleep, over the coffee that had been the first and last ritual of every day at Blackridge since she'd arrived. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said. "I'm good, actually." And she was. She was both things at once, the complexity of it, the enormousness of it, and fine. He reached across the table and took her hand, both of his around one of hers, the way he'd held it against the fence that afternoon with the handkerchief, steady and real and present. "We're going to need a bigger table," he said. She laughed. The same real laugh, the one from somewhere she'd forgotten was there. "You're going to say that, aren't you? Every time." "It's the correct thing to say." "It's not even... The table seats 5. "We've been using a stool," he said. "That's not a real seat." She was still laughing when Nora came downstairs and looked at them suspiciously and said, "What?" And Evelyn said, "Nothing. Go back to bed." And Nora said it was already 7:30, which was practically noon, and Clara came in behind her with Pepper at her heels, and then Danny, and then Lucas appearing in the doorway still half asleep in the way 13-year-olds are constitutionally required to be on Sunday mornings. They were all in the kitchen, 5 of them, and soon another one. Gideon looked at her over the coffee cups and the morning noise of it all, and his expression was not complicated. It was the face of a man who had built a table in anger and grief and stubborn, irrational hope, and who had sat alone at it for 8 years, and who was now exactly where he'd built it to be. She looked back at him. She thought about the woman she'd been when she drove through that gate. The $31, the cardigan, the practiced speech about the number. The woman who had learned to say the count before anyone else could say it against her. Who had treated her children like a deficit and herself like a problem to be apologized for. Who had gotten so good at waiting for things to go wrong that she'd almost missed the evidence that something was going right. She thought about what it had taken. Not one large thing, but 10,000 small ones. A cup of coffee handed across a counter, a handkerchief pressed to a cut, a note about blankets on the second shelf, a man who sat on the floor and told the actual thing to a frightened boy, an 8-year table waiting for the people who were always coming. She thought, the math was never wrong. I was just counting the wrong things. 4 children had not made her less. They were the things she had to offer, Dito. Her specific, irreplaceable, loud, and complicated and wonderful 4 children who were now 5 chairs at a table that was about to need replacing, who were the reason a lonely ranch in the middle of the frontier had stopped being empty and started being a home. She had spent 3 years subtracting herself. All she'd ever needed to do was walk through the gate. Gideon built the new table in the spring. He did it in the barn over the course of 3 weeks, in the evenings after the work was done, and the children came and went while he worked on it. Clara narrating her opinions on the dimensions, Danny measuring things twice with the seriousness of a junior engineer, Nora sketching it in her notebook, Lucas handing him tools and occasionally asking questions about the joinery that led to long practical conversations Evelyn could hear through the open barn door. The baby arrived in June. A girl, which Clara considered a personal victory, and they named her June, simple and plainly for the month she arrived in, because they were people who liked things to mean what they said. The table seated 8. Gideon said they'd probably need to add a leaf inside of 3 years. Lucas said, "Pa, we're not having more kids," in the exasperated tone of a teenager who has strong opinions about family planning. And Danny said, "Actually, border collies can have 6 to 8 in a litter," which was not related, but Danny had been waiting to deploy that fact and felt the moment was right. And Clara said, "Pepper's having puppies?" And the kitchen erupted in the specific controlled chaos that had become the permanent weather of Blackridge Ranch. And Evelyn sat at her end of the table with June in her arms and looked at all of it. The noise, the hands reaching for the bread, Pepper circling under the table waiting for something to drop, Gideon at the other end, restoring order with the patient, unhurried competence he brought to everything, catching her eye over the chaos with the small private look that was just for her, the one that said, "Look at this. Look at what we built." She looked at all of it, and she did not count a single thing. She didn't need to. Every chair was full.